I think you're here because you read a lot about Chris Thomas, who is our speaker for today. So I'm not going to tell you any more about his credentials because you already know about him. But I really want to welcome you, Chris, and I want you to welcome Chris. So many, many thanks for being here. Thank you, Chris Thomas.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Marilyn, thank you very much. And Judy, thank you for suggesting that I come talk with you all. It's nice to be here with family. I've got half my family over at this table. Cousin Margie and Barb and my sister Catherine and of course my wife Kristen. So we are off on our belated honeymoon to Paris in southern France. Due to airline changes, we're on a little tighter schedule than we thought we would be, so we've got a flight out of O'Hare early evening. So we will be heading out as soon as we finish up here. I would like to note that it's been a very interesting year for me. I've gotten married, I've retired, and I've relocated to St. Joseph. Yeah, it's great to be back. I grew up here and haven't been back other than to visit for a number of years. So when Kristen and I were dating, we had a 15-minute conversation about her moving to Okemos, Michigan, outside of East Lansing. And once the 15-minute clock rang, I realized I was moving to St. Joseph. But I gave her credit. She gave me 15 minutes. You know, you can't ask for anything better than that. My plans originally were just to retire and then figure out what to do, but certainly not to work. As my good fortune on the way out the door is at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. It's a think tank. Asked me to come work with them, and I started with them in September. So they're an interesting organization, and I'll talk a little more about them. They were founded on a concept of bipartisan by four former senators, Bob Dole, George Mitchell, Howard Baker, and Tom Daschle. So 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. The idea is not to be nonpartisan, but is to be bipartisan and bring your issues to the table, argue them out, and come up with the best programs that each party has to offer and make any necessary compromises. I've also had the opportunity to serve on the board of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Election Data and Science Board, which has just begun in the last year, and they're collecting studies and funding studies on elections in the United States. So today I plan on addressing my work with the Bipartisan Policy Center, Michigan's election administration system, the 2018 election, and then a variety of issues which will deal with security and fraud and court cases and all the fun things that are out there. So the Bipartisan Policy Center received a grant to carry forward President Obama's Bipartisan Commission on Election Administration. The initiative was started after the 2012 election, in which many lines were experienced across the country. And President Obama indicated that we need to do something about that. And so that was the genesis of the commission. It was bipartisan. Bob Bauer was the attorney for Obama during the election, and Ben Ginsberg was the attorney for Mitt Romney during the election. And those 2 gentlemen are renowned election lawyers in Washington and across the country, and they ran a very good ship, and I was honored to be part of that. We issued our report in January 2014, and it's state-based. It is not Washington, D.C. based. It doesn't call on Congress to do a darn thing, because they wouldn't do a darn thing anyway. So this really focuses on state and local governments on how to make Election Day a better experience. So these were very nuts and bolts issues dealing with a whole variety of things. We came up with a benchmark saying that really 30 minutes is as long as anyone should wait to vote. That is something that in many areas of this country and even in this state is not the case. Now there are times when that won't be possible. For some reason, everybody likes to show up first thing in the morning. And so if there's 100 people standing outside waiting to get in, it's probably going to take you a little more than 30 minutes. But generally, 30 minutes should be the benchmark. We also dealt with online voter registration as a recommendation. And there are now 40 states that have online registration, and I'll talk about Michigan in a minute. We also advocated for multi-state data sharing. So when people move from one state to another, that data catches up so that each state's voter registration rolls can stay as clean as possible. We have many best practices for poll workers, for recruiting and training poll workers. That is a common issue around the country for people to find the necessary resources to run elections. On any given November election, we probably have between 30 and 35,000 poll workers across the state working, which I'd call about the largest part-time workforce, at least in this state. So there are a number of others. I've had the opportunity since joining Bipartisan to work in Florida, Missouri, Arizona, Iowa, just to name a few, and also here in Michigan. So we have been pushing online voter registration. Now, in Michigan, we've sort of got it for most people. If you're already registered to vote and you go to the Secretary of State's website to change your driver's license address because you've moved, it will automatically move your voter registration with it. So for the bulk of the people that are already registered and use our online services, we do have online voter registration. What we don't have is online voter registration for somebody who's not registered already. And so the legislation that we've been working on has moved very nicely through the Senate. It's moved through the House committee and is sitting on the House floor now, and we hope to see that enacted hopefully by this summer. It won't be in effect because there's work that has to be done, but at least it'll be on the books. That's a big step forward, and Michigan will kind of catch up with the rest of these states. The other issue I've done quite a bit of work on is the Lines Project. So we started working with large counties around the United States, and Michigan jumped in with many jurisdictions who have agreed to participate in this program. And what it is merely at the top of every hour, the poll worker will write down the number of people in line. And then they ship that through the Bureau of Elections with the Secretary of State's office off to us. We put it in the computer, we will generate graphs and charts, and it will show the clerks where their peaks and valleys are and make some projections for them. A lot of clerks don't even know whether they have lines or not. It used to be you found out when the newspaper called and the local TV station was out there filming these people standing in line. Sometimes the lines are caused by malfunctions in equipment. Sometimes the resources are not adequate for the people all to get in and get out without mass confusion. So these are things that we really think every clerk in the state should be looking at and participating in so they know whether they have lines or not. And if you have a line, you can fix them. And so there's a whole science out there on lines, as you can imagine. So part of our deal when we were on this presidential commission is we went to Disney World. And we actually had one of the commissioners was from Disney World. I guess you can be from Disney World, right? It's a location of sorts. He had both feet on the ground and no costume or anything. So it's a different world when you get behind the scenes at Disney World. It's not so pretty downstairs. They had a bunch of kids in t-shirts watching cameras, both for California and for Orlando. and they were watching choke points, and they could reposition people. We thought that was great. We weren't really sure how we were going to replicate that in our election process, but it was interesting, which is one of the issues with elections, is that we don't control our own destinies as administrators. We don't own the facilities, the storefronts, if you will. We rely on libraries and schools and churches. More and more with churches and synagogues are becoming the polling places. And then finally, we advocate for ERIC, which is a nonprofit organization run by states that has the Pew Charitable Trust put it together and built a computer program. And what it does for each member state, it takes their driver's license, their voter registration. And so when people move, and you keep putting that information in, and they check it with National Change of Address and the Social Security National Death List, not a list you want to be on, it can then report back to a state that so-and-so has moved, they're registered now in Arizona or Florida. So we're hoping that the next Secretary of State will join ERIC. Legislation was just signed by Governor Snyder to allow Michigan to enter into that type of program. So those are some of the things I've been working on since retiring. And this is only a 25% job, so I'm a part-timer. None of this full-time. My wife is shaking her head, but it's true. So let me talk about Michigan's system just a little bit. So very decentralized, one of the most decentralized in the country. Michigan and Wisconsin have a lot in common in that regard. So you've got the Secretary of State at the top of this pyramid. They've got 83 county clerks, and you've got about 1,514 city and township clerks, all of whom have a piece of the administration of elections in the state. So roughly there's about 1,600 county, city, and township clerks. Secretary of State is basically the chief election officer for the state and has authority to both train, investigate, and advise local election officials. Most other states run their elections at the county level. They're county-based. Cities and townships are not involved in elections. In Michigan, we would just have 83 election officials, but that's not the case. So we have more officials than any other state except Wisconsin. They have 1,800. So we have consolidated elections over the years. In 2003, legislature removed schools from running elections, so there's 500 election officials that were scraped off. They removed villages from running their own elections. There's a couple hundred more. So we got lighter when that happened. So as I noted, the Secretary of State is the chief election officer and has a great deal of authority. In a lot of other states, the Secretary of State's pretty advisory. In this state, particularly coming out of the Soapy William recounts back in the late 40s, early 50s, it was really shown how a decentralized system really operates as people doing whatever they want to do. And somebody needs to set some uniformity. So they gave that authority to the Secretary of State. They created the position I held, which is Director of Elections. They made that a civil service position, thank God. Otherwise, after Mr. Austin left, I probably would have been out on my ear. And it's one of the few in the country that are that way. Most directors of elections are at-will employees that they're political appointees that come and go with the Secretary of State. I've worked for one Democrat, Richard Austin, from 1977 to 1994, and now, until last June, 3 Republican Secretaries of State since then, Candace Miller, Terry Land, and Ruth Johnson. I have no problem working with Democrats or Republicans. I've always taken the position that they're the elected official, they're the policy maker. I like to put my 2 cents in. They're always happy to hear that. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. But that's the way the thing is set up. And so what we've been able to keep is a staff that has continuity to it, even though secretaries of state come and go. I told Ruth Johnson, I said, we're the furniture. You know, when you leave, we'll still be here. I didn't know I was going to leave, but yeah, I'm not there, but the staff is there. Sally Williams succeeded me. She's done a marvelous job. She came up through the Department of State, and they are carrying on with the election administration, campaign finance, lobbyist registration, and they even have the Great Seal, which has to be fed 4 times a day in order to keep it healthy. So. It is interesting as we work through the Presidential Commission that it was, we had some academic folks that assisted us, and they really brought the point home. And if you read the report, which you can find on the Bipartisan Policy Center's website or on the Election Assistance Commission's website, they note in the introduction is that really no other democracy uses this country's administration as a model. And that's because in this country, partisan officials are very much ensconced in the conduct of elections. Our Secretary of State, the county clerks, township clerks, and a number of the city clerks all run for election on partisan issues. In most other democracies around the world, they have bureaucrats doing that are not elected and don't carry that imprint of a political party. We seem to make it work with a lot of checks and balances. So, you know, everybody does it a little different. The Board of State Canvassers, which we'll talk about in a minute, they're 4 members, bipartisan. Each county has a county board of canvassers and also election commission. So we have lots of officials with their hands in our elections. We also consolidated the number of elections each year. So we are now down to 3 elections that you can have each year. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but not many. And that changes from a time when any jurisdiction in the state could call an election within about a 60-day period for a millage or tax increase or a bonding issue. So now these things are all consolidated down. So the state role in elections is huge. It has really emerged as a technology issue. We have a statewide voter registration system. We're involved with the voting systems. We have online training for election officials. All of this is a lot of technology. Now, when I started in the Bureau of Elections in 1981, when I moved up to the Bureau, there were 4 phone lines, 4. And there was no voicemail. And when all 4 lights were lit up, that was it. They were busy. And you could call back if you wanted to. I mean, that's almost unheard of today. The system I know the state has, it just keeps moving and pushing it off to different people automatically. And at the worst cases, you have to leave a voicemail. And then you add email on top of that. I mean, the communication is huge. When I started, we had carbon paper. I mean, that's what it was. I mean, it's an incredible change. So 2018, what a big year, huh? I mean, you see out here, they had one of the petitions for people to sign when you came in. That is going on all over the state. And because of term limits, all of our statewide electeds are up. So you've got governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general. They're all up. There's no incumbent. And that makes for a lot of fun if you like to follow politics, because there's a lot of jockeying around. There'll be a lot of money involved, no question about that. So you will see a lot of that. Also, U.S. Senate is up. Debbie Stabenow is running for re-election. Our state Senate is up. Our state House is up. We've got county commissioners. Some cities will have elections. No townships this year. They're on the presidential unless they've got some vacancies. And villages and schools are also on the November election. So that was the third consolidation we did. We moved all these offices. Schools used to be in June or May. Villages used to be in February and April. All of those have now moved to the even year November election. So we have a long ballot. We have one of the longest ballots in the United States. 19, 20-inch ballot, both sides pretty well filled up, depending on the number of ballot proposals. And in some areas, they move to a second ballot, which just makes election day that much more interesting as people try to manage two separate ballots. So I think we have a record year from what I'm reading in terms of number of candidates who filed. So we're going to have a lot of choices. I'm going to make a comment because somebody did approach me about open primaries. I won't point that person out. We do have open primaries here, but you can only vote in one party's primary. You pick it in the privacy of the voting booth, but if you cross over, that tabulator is going to send your ballot back to you and tell you you need to try again. And as I was explaining to this person, that's far better than the old days of punch card where people did that generally. It went into the can and then they were counted election night, so they never got a second chance, and those ballots were not counted. So if you cross over once, your entire partisan ballot is voided. But now you at least have second chance voting. So let's look at ballot questions. So this is a very interesting year for ballot questions. And this is what the Board of State Canvassers handles. And they do the canvassing of these petitions, which come in, I think a constitutional amendment's around 317 or 18,000 signatures. So they'll file maybe 400,000 just to be safe. So you can see you get 4 or 5 of those, you're getting up to millions of signatures sitting in boxes in the Bureau of Elections. And there's no way anybody's going to sit and look at each of those pages. So we used a random sampling process. We've been doing that since the late 70s, and it's worked pretty well. And we've had some situations where it's gotten a little contentious, and then we've actually been able to prove that that sampling is pretty much right on the money as to what the shape of the petition is in. So the first one is a prevailing wage issue, which this deals with eliminating generally the union wage in public construction. So this is their second time around. Their first time around, the random sampling found no way. You didn't have enough signatures. You spent a lot of money with a contractor to collect all these signatures, and you came up with a big 0. So they went back out, recirculated again, have come in. The Bureau has said, yes, you have enough signatures. The board deadlocked on it, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. It is in court. The Court of Appeals ordered the board to put it on the ballot. The one side that was challenging the petition is going on, excuse me, to the state Supreme Court. So we'll see how that comes out. So these are issues with out-of-state circulators. They're kind of like gypsies. They move around the country. They make a pretty good living, but they live in hotels and trailers, and they just move around, and it's who's ever paying the highest price. So they might start out paying $1 a signature, but as they get close to the filing deadline, depending on how many have come in, it can go up to $5 a signature. So they move around. States like California, Washington, huge ballot proposal states, Oregon. So a lot of issues come up as to where they actually live. If this will never be on the ballot, okay? I mean, either the Supreme Court will throw it out, or if they don't, a legislative initiative is a 2-step process. First you get the signatures, or maybe it's 3 steps. If you have enough signatures, it goes to the legislature, and they can enact it. So that's the way the people can enact a law, tell the legislature, get off your duffs and enact this. But the one key is the governor has no role. And that's what's going on here. Snyder said he would not sign a bill that if the legislature passed it to get rid of the prevailing wage. So the only way to get around the governor is to do a legislative initiative. If it goes to the legislature, they will enact it. I don't think there's any question about that. And it'll become law. It does not need the signature of the governor. So that one you won't get the vote on. I can pretty well assure you that. The second one, of course, is marijuana legalization. Seems to be the new deal. You'll be checking your meetings in the future. No brownies allowed, you know. So even though it's legal, yeah. So that one was certified, clean petition, came in certified. It's gone to the legislature. They have until June 5 to decide whether they're going to enact it or not. Very interesting speculation here. It's Republican legislature, right? Are they going to enact the legalization of marijuana? Generally, you would say, well, heck no. I would vote, I would bet that no way would they do that. But some polling saying that marijuana might bring 3% more people out that perhaps would vote Democratic. So maybe we should just go ahead, because it's going to pass anyway. It's polling at 65%. So maybe we should just go ahead and enact it so that it's not on the ballot, doesn't become a draw to bring people out to vote. And in the Senate, that's a pretty big deal. The House, not so much. Now, if you want to listen to the conspiracy theorists even more, they say, yeah, the House will enact it, and then in the lame duck session in late November, early December, they'll repeal it. And I said, well, I don't know. There'll be people marching on Lansing if that happens. The whole place will go up in a cloud of smoke. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. So kind of watch your papers around June 5, see what the legislature, how cunning they're going to be on this. Part-time legislature, they folded 10. There was a lot of noise about that earlier last year. They were all hip to go, and they've gone away. So there's 3 others that until last week nobody really thought had a chance, and one of them is out here being circulated. And the Bureau got a call from one of the chief sponsors and says, oh no, we're shooting for May 30th, which is the deadline to put this thing on the ballot. And that deals with the clean energy, which is an incremental increase in the percentage of renewable resources for electric power. So it would go up until 2030, it'd be up to 30%. So that one's moving, or at least they're out there working. Signatures are probably getting a little more money for each one. Raise Michigan, which implements an earned paid sick leave that people can use for personal and family health needs. And then the other is Michigan One Fair Wage, which incrementally raises the minimum wage to $10 in 2019, and by 2021 it would be up to $12. So none of these, if they have enough signatures, will be enacted by the legislature. You can pretty much bet on that. So if they pass muster, you will be seeing these on your ballot. So I was going to say the best 2 for last, the ones that are really going to cause a lot of consternation in terms of the we'll just call it the establishment. A lot of us were around in the 60s, right? The establishment was those people. It's now us. So the voters, not politicians. That's the big one. And as Marilyn indicated, the league is involved with this, at least have supported this. It sets up a commission of 13 citizens. Sets up the Independent Citizens Redistricting Committee, which would be called ICRIC. Every acronym's got a deal. There'd be 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 5 non-affiliated. So these would be people that might be with minor parties or at least profess they're with no party. And you can have that long debate over beer someday about whether anybody is really independent, you know. And I've always argued from an administrative viewpoint, because I've been accused of being one or the other at different times depending who I angered by a particular decision, is that, you know, there's a certain group of people that, particularly when you're in Lansing or Washington, that are in that little bubble in political parties, and that's what they live. I mean, their worldview is their political party view. For the rest of us, we may have a political party leaning or preference, but it's not our driver. And you can't really convince folks in that bubble that that's really true. Their view is there's no black and white. It's you're either one or you're the other. And I frankly don't think that's the case. This commission would be pretty autonomous from state government in terms of funding. Very tight restrictions on who could be a member of this commission. This is what really has people in Lansing very on edge, because if any time in the last 6 years you've been a candidate, you have a family member who's a candidate, you've been an officer of a political party, you've been a lobbyist or a lobbyist agent. I've been a lobbyist agent. I was required to be one for the Secretary of State's office. If you've worked for a political person, if you've worked in the legislature, none of those people are qualified to serve on this commission. So it is going to be people who really are not connected to the political process. Do you want to ask a question? Okay. So they have standards in there. Some of them are a little vague. Communities of interest are a little vague. You can look at various communities. Obviously, the courts in Congress have required absolute equality between districts, where the courts have allowed for legislative districts that there can be about a 10%, 5% up, 5% down variation in districts. Currently in Michigan, we have this little game that started in 1982 by the Michigan Supreme Court, which basically says the plan that wins is the one that breaks the fewest county lines, and then within counties breaks the fewest city and township lines, and stays within these percentage margins that are mandated by the courts. This process will broaden that a little bit and will be very interesting. The Secretary of State, she has to, I say she, but it might be a he, has to mail 10,000 applications out to voters randomly selected from the voter registration file. She's got it, people are able to apply without receiving that mailing. She, at the end of the day, has to end up with, 30 Democrats, 30 Republicans, and 40 non-affiliated. The 4 legislative leaders each get to disqualify 5 people out of that 100. One in the Republicans can do theirs. Democrats do theirs. I don't think anybody gets to do the other one. And then from that group that's left, the people that are going to serve will be randomly selected. So you can see a whole TV show here, right? I mean, you thought the lotto was fun. This is going to be a whole big deal, you know, behind door number 2. And that's how they're going to select them. And so there's a huge consternation up there. And there's a lawsuit has already been filed to try to stop the board from even canvassing this petition. One of their main factors, they keep saying, these people that are going to be on here don't know nothing. They know nothing about dealing with the complexity of redistricting, of using census data, looking at political maps that overlie the census data. It's gotten very sophisticated. When I started in '82, we were doing reapportionment. And what we did, there was a commission back then. We were auditing the plan. We were on our hands and knees. with acetate over a map, coloring in census tracts and blocks, particularly in Ann Arbor, because there's townships in the middle of the city, and you had to make sure that they're all in the same district. Well, their way, nobody is getting their hands dirty anymore. This is all done by computers. They take census data, they overlay political data in terms of each precinct, how it's voted. They know a lot about you. They know a lot about you from your votes in presidential primaries. That's where they do pick up how you voted because your party was disclosed there. So this is going to be very interesting one to watch. The lawsuit says this is a revision of the Constitution, which cannot be done by amendment. I think that's baloney myself, but that occurred back in 2008 with Reform Michigan. It was a huge petition that really touched all areas. The Supreme Court didn't allow it on. This is pretty narrow, and it deals with one subject matter. So we'll see where that goes. And as Marilyn indicated, you all are plaintiffs in the federal lawsuit. So that's good for you. I mean, like, keep it stirred up a little bit. I mean, it's a question worth answering. The courts have held that incumbency is a viable factor in redistricting. I always found that. I taught law school for 13 years. I taught redistricting. I always found that is so strange that those who draw the maps can consider where the lines go based on where the incumbents reside. It's not the primary thing, but it is a factor. And that's always struck me as odd.
Did you say that was a federal factor? Federal Supreme Court?
Yes, indeed. Yes. So then the other big one is promote the vote. Now this one is very interesting because what this recognizes is that it has been extremely difficult in the last 16 years to get legislation through Lansing, dealing with moving forward with opening up the election process. And if this thing is found sufficient, goes to the ballot, and you all enact it, it will definitely open up the system. So it does a couple things, which not very shocking. It says it sets it all up is that electors in Michigan have the following rights. Well, one is to vote a secret ballot. Everyone goes, well, yeah, okay, we do that now. There's nothing too strange about that. It also says there should be a straight party voting choice. Well, we kind of do that now. We're halfway between an act that repealed straight party and a court decision that says, no, you didn't do it right. So we had straight party in 2016. There's a trial that's ending sometime late this month, and then a decision to follow in federal court to see whether the law that was enacted in 2015 actually goes into effect. So that's still up in the air.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
Legally, as I understand it, the voters voted in twice to have straight party voting in the legislature. How can the legislature overturn that when the citizens have voted it in? I don't understand.
The question is through referendum, have they enacted 2 times in Michigan's history, the most recent, 2002, the legislature enacted a bill to repeal straight party voting. The Democratic Party filed petitions of referendum that held the law in abeyance, put it on the ballot, and the voters overwhelmingly approved it. So this time around, in order for that not to happen, they put an appropriation on it. And the Constitution says you cannot do a referendum on an appropriation. That's become the more recent device in Lansing over the last 10 years, where they have controversial issues that they do not want the voters to vote on through referendum. They will put a very small appropriation on it. Clearly not what the drafters of the 1963 Constitution envisioned. They were looking at regular appropriation bills, because if you could repeal, if you could do a referendum on a regular appropriation, you'd bring the government to a standstill, right? Well, that's not what's going on here. So we'll just see where that goes. Automatic registration with the opportunity at the Secretary of State's office with an opportunity to decline. Well, Richard Austin was the father of motor voter in 1975. It was the first in the nation. It was put into federal law in the 90s. We do motor voter very well, very well. You are asked when you come in to change your driver's license address or apply for a new one. Any driver's license transaction, you are asked whether you want to register to vote. So it's all this does is turn it the other way. And it says you will be registered to vote and you'll be given an opportunity to say, no, I don't want to be. And that's what's being called automatic registration.
Are they asked if they're a citizen?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Yep. And they have paperwork that you are or aren't. No reason absentee balloting is in this proposal by mail or in person. That fight's been going on in the Michigan legislature since 1990. And it's gotten fairly close recently with one that requires ID and you have to apply in a clerk's office. This would be by mail like most other states. The close of registration right now is 30 days before the election. You have to register by that time in order to vote. This would move it to 15 days before the election, which is no big deal with the technology today. And it would say you could continue to vote all the way up through Election Day if you do that in the clerk's office with proof of residency. That's new. It's got a little Election Day spin on it there that is going to bring out some pretty strong opposition. But it's in the clerk's office. It is not in the polling place. Wisconsin, they do Election Day registration in the polling place. Here, you'd have to go to the clerk's office. So we'll see where that goes. And it also mandates that there at least be 8 hours where the clerk's office is open during the weekend before the election so that you can go to the clerk's office and apply for and receive an absentee ballot. Now, clerks are generally open now from 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock on Saturdays. In fact, they're mandated to be open until 2 o'clock on Saturdays under current law. So for a lot of jurisdictions, that's 6 hours that's already there. All of these provisions have been done somewhere else, are being done somewhere else in the United States. And the other one that Michigan does, we obviously do the secret ballot, and we have a law that says that overseas and military voters have to be sent their ballot 45 days before the election. So that's also in there. There are 27 states that do no reason AV. There are 20 states that have reasons for voting absentee. And there are 37 states that have early voting, which is not part of this proposal. So that proposal is going to be very interesting. And there will probably be a lot of money spent on both sides of that going into the election. They seem to think they're on the track to be filing. Their filing deadline is early July. So we'll wait and see what's there. So turnout, that's the big deal. That's the question. You know, who wins and loses is determined by who shows up to vote and who doesn't show up to vote. So we've had you hear this wave election. A lot of talk about a blue wave. Well, it's early. You'll see. You know, don't count those eggs yet because there may be no chickens in them. It's real early. You have to wait and see in terms of who is mobilized by the fall and particularly in November. So the combination of any kind of wave is usually a big turnout by one party or another party staying home. So when you look at the turnout numbers in Michigan, Republicans do very well when the number's about 3.2 million voters. When it goes higher, Democrats will increase their success rate. So the last decade, there was basically about a 3-election wave for Democrats. Now, it started in 2004. Now, they didn't win the presidency, but in Michigan, obviously, the Democrat did win. There were 4.8 million people voted in that presidential election. That was 600,000 more than voted in the presidential election of 2000. Now, you would have thought 2000, with no incumbent, it would have been a higher turnout. Usually when there's no incumbent, both sides are very active, you get a little better turnout, but not the case. 2006, that was a midterm election, Jennifer Granholm's second election. 3.852 million people showed up to vote. You notice a good 600,000 more than that standard 3.1, 3.2 million. And she easily won. The Democrats took the House, not the Senate. And then, of course, you had 2008. Now, while the numbers didn't go up, it went up about 159,000 more, but for the first time, Michigan peaked over 5 million voters. So that was sort of the top of the Democratic deal. 2010 came around, no 3.8 million. Those Democrats who showed up in that presidential election, they were nowhere to be found in 2010. Right back down, 3.2 million. Democrats stayed home, energized Republicans, Tea Party, whatnot, came out, put a Republican in the governor's chair, took the House back, retained the Senate. So that continued. Obama won Michigan in 2012. It was lower than 2016, and certainly lower than 2008. So you could see he started to go down, and Hillary just continued it. You can just watch just like that. And the Republicans, Mitt Romney did far better than Mr. McCain, and Donald Trump did better than Romney. The presidential election turnout in 2016 was almost exactly the same as a 2004 turnout. So 4,875,000 people, which is a healthy turnout in Michigan. Not 5 million, but 4.8 million. All through the 80s and the 90s, we had 3.8, 3.9 million. We're dealing with clearly 1 million more people voting since 2004 than had voted in presidential elections in the past. So turnout, we're at about 7.3 million right now, registered voters. So the question of this year, are we going to be a 3.2 million turnout, or are we going to be closer to a 3.8? There's your ball game right there. And even with a 3.8, there are still people that can be mobilized on both sides of that coin. So that is going to be the issue. I think the governor's race is going to be close. I think Democrats will take the House, but they will not take the Senate. I doubt they'll take the Senate. I think there's like 10 Democrats right now out of 38 senators. So it's not likely they're going to take that. So let me just wrap up here pretty quickly. I'm not sure what time it is. I don't see my wife sweating or anything. We'll be okay, dear. 2 o'clock's really not, it won't turn into a pumpkin, honest. So I'm going to wrap up real quick, just making a few comments on security. That is an issue, right? You all hear about it. You can, if you turn on your TV, you hear about, are the Russians coming? The answer is no. They've been here since 2014. So there's 2 areas here that are of critical. One is voter registration, and the other is the voting system itself. When you look at voter registration, we have a statewide system. We were one of the first in the country that did that. It's called the Qualified Voter File. It's behind a firewall at the state. So we're really not worried like a lot of other states where these may be sitting in county offices, and all counties are not created equally, right? And so some are going to have really good security, some are going to have some issues. Here, at least we have one, and we've got, the state of Michigan has some pretty darn good IT staff and resources. We are capable of doing our own scanning. Whether they work with the Department of Homeland Security probably remains to be seen. They are working very closely with them. These election officials are getting security clearances so that Homeland Security can actually share threats that are coming for the various states. Local election officials are going to learn a whole lot about cybersecurity, more than they ever wanted to know. Probably will result in even more retirements. But each voter should go online in Michigan and check their voter registration before each election. It's all there, michigan.gov/vote. You can check your registration status and see your sample ballot. We're ahead of the curve because for voting systems, the entire state will have a new voting system in this election. There's 3 voting systems. Some of you may have seen them in local elections last year, but they're being rolled out statewide. They're paper-based, so I think we're going to be in very good shape there. On election day, the tabulators are not connected to any wireless modems or anything. They're standalone devices plugged into the wall. The servers and county clerks that receive the unofficial results are not connected to the internet. So there are steps that have been taken to make sure that there is no access. And the state has moved ahead with post-election audits. They do that, had performance audits. They have now begun actually counting ballots as part of their, randomly, as part of their post-election audit. So again, are the Russians coming? Well, you know, there's really 2 important documents that I will point you to that if, you know, to basically, you know, put all the other garbage aside. And that's the special counsel indictment of the 13 Russians. Just Google that and it'll come up. Read it. It's like a grade B movie. I mean, it is amazing what they were doing since 2014. And what it says is that the Russians allegedly posed as Americans to operate bogus social media accounts, buy advertisements, and stage political rallies. They stole identities of real people in the United States to post online and build computer systems in the U.S. to hide the Russian origin of their activity, according to the prosecutors. They've been here, they've been working, so that's a must read. So that's on sort of the social network side that's worth taking a look at. You can see what kind of shenanigans they've been up to. And then the second one is that just in the past week, the Senate Intelligence Committee has issued a bipartisan interim report. If you see a partisan report, you can read it if it makes you happy, but it's probably not going to tell the whole story. Look for a bipartisan report. They've concluded that 18 states were targeted, maybe 6 additional, or 3 additional were also targeted. That part of the process, and Michigan was not reported as one of those. 6 states were scanned, and they were actually at the point where they could conduct malicious access. A small number of states, Illinois in particular, they were in their voter registration system to the point where they could have deleted, altered, or added data to voter registrations. So at that point, the thought was, it was to discredit the system, to cause confusion on election day. So all of a sudden you go to vote and your name's not there. We have ways to handle that, but they're time consuming. That was the general thought. Now, it's clear that, that many of these were aimed at helping Donald Trump. That is clear. Whether Donald Trump was involved with them, that's all the static you're listening to on cable news. And that remains to be seen. But clearly the Russians had made their decisions. These are facts. I mean, I think you can pretty much rely on this. There is no real issue of whether the Russians were involved. They were involved. And I think 60 Minutes demonstrated that they actually used the phone line that they almost have never used. It was the first time on cyber issues to warn the Russians off in October. It says, we know what you're doing, knock it off. And so it's unclear by the Senate report as to whether their conclusion was they don't know if the Russians, because they were warned off, stopped and didn't do it, or they were really just preparing for a future attack down the road, and this was an exploratory to see how far into the systems they could get. So the Department of Homeland Security is very involved with the states now. The states are very much involved. Congress has appropriated $380 million. Michigan will get about 11 million of that to put towards cybersecurity and elections. So let me talk about fraud, and then I'm going to end. Fraud's always the divider. So if you want to find out who's on one side of the room, fraud will do it. It's one of those parlor games that usually don't end well. So this is my take. This is my personal take. The parties use fraud and suppression as fundraising. It's part of their gig. And so the Republicans believe that the Democrats are stealing elections. The Democrats believe that the Republicans try to enact laws that suppress the vote, that stop certain people from voting. Those are the two polls that are out there. And depending on which poll and how close to those polls you are, as you move out there, it's like religion, okay? You're not going to have that discussion. You're not going to change anyone's mind. This is the way it is. My opinion, having been in this business for 40-some years, there is no pervasive fraud in the United States of America. Is there fraud? Yes, it does occur, just like there are crimes that occur, but there is no pervasive fraud. So when Donald Trump says 3.5 million or 5 million illegal people voted in the United States, that is bunk. That did not occur, and there is nobody with any kind of legitimacy who has yet come up and put the scenario together to show where that could have happened. It did not happen. So I really urge people to just, chill on that and not get too worked up either by MSNBC that's going to tell you about suppression or Fox News that's going to tell you all about voter fraud. You can pass a law that does voter ID that is not a suppression. We have a law in Michigan that went into effect in 2007. The following year, we had over 5 million people vote. I don't think there was any suppression attached to that law, because if you didn't have an ID, you just filed an affidavit and you voted, and your ballot counted. Now, if the legislature later this year goes to hard ID, now that's a different question, because those people without ID will vote a provisional ballot. And the reality is, most provisional ballots don't count, because people don't go back in within 6 days and haul their ID down there. And I mean, it's human nature. The election's over, the election's over. So that, you can get into it. We run into questions. Oh, there's a sign on the village township or the township hall where they're voting that says ID required right on the door before people get in. Well, you can make the case that's a suppression because it turns people away. Or you can make the case that there's some clerk out there who's just, well, we're voter ID, they write it. They're not thinking about the niceties of how it's stated. But the reality is people may be turned away by that who don't have their ID with them. I know a certain Secretary of State who went to vote without her purse. It happens, right? I mean, it just happens. And there's a way to handle that now. We've got a good law now that doesn't really do much for that. So you'll find fraud. There is some fraud out there, but it's isolated fraud, and it needs to be handled in that way, but not with any view that there's some massive fraud. So there's always this thing. There's buses in Detroit bringing Hispanics in, and they go from polling place to polling place, and they all file off, and they go in, they vote. This has been, I've heard this for 2 decades. Detroit is swarming with challengers on election day. And not a one of them has ever come back with a picture of a bus with Hispanic people rolling out who are not on the rolls, you know, so they all come in and want to do this affidavit ballot thing. It just isn't there. And it's in their best interest, those challengers, that if that's true, to provide some evidence that that's true. That would be a great thing if that were really happening, to be able to shut that down. So the only thing I'll end on is sort of a comical thing. Selfies in the polling place, right? So God forbid we can't take a selfie in the polling place. It's like, oh my God, you know, this is my constitutional rights are just being torn apart because I can't do a selfie in the polling place. Well, I'll tell you, people fought hard to make sure you have a secret ballot. And in Michigan, it's illegal for you to expose your ballot in a polling place. And the penalty you pay if you expose your ballot in a polling place is that ballot is voided and you're out of luck, you're done. And people don't really do that. Well, when we did some work on this court case, it's actually in court, we did some scenarios with people, you know, using sticks to take these things like people will do, right? You can see right over the little thing into the next guy's ballot. I mean, it is ridiculous, but that's sort of the age we live in. So that's actually in court, and we'll see where it goes. There was a time, this law was passed in 1890s. Up until that time, the political parties printed their own ballots. They were all straight party. You know, you didn't pick between candidates in different parties. And what you would do is that all the lobbyists and the corporations, there weren't unions at this time, would all line up. And you as an employee, you would have to show that ballot. They were different colors. So they knew before you put it in the box exactly who you were voting for. And that's where that came from. So in the 1890s, they passed that, and they said now the county will print the ballots, and they'll hand them out. These were handed out at a rally where everybody was drinking, and they handed out these ballots, and they marched everybody down there at the same time, and that's the way it worked. So that's why we're opposed to selfies. So not because people might be drinking, but because there could be problems. So I'm going to end right there. I've gone on probably longer than I should. Thank you very much. We can do questions, that's fine.
The last thing we want to do for the League of Women Voters is to interfere with the honeymoon. So, if you feel as though the time has come, we will respect that and invite you to come back on another occasion.
We can do a few
Might
questions.
be a really good idea.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Okay,
We can do
good.
that.
Yes, right back here.
I've voted in about 5 different states. I don't remember one asking me whether or having proof that I was a U.S. citizen. Is there
No.
any proof in any states?
No.
in Michigan to get a driver's license.
The question is the gentleman has voted in 5 different states, and he doesn't recall being asked to prove that he was a United States citizen. So the way that happens now is a couple different ways. One, it's on the form. There is a question that you check when you register to vote, that you are not a U.S. citizen. So it's there. Over 80% of our registrations are through the Secretary of State's office. So when you go, you have shown a birth certificate at Secretary of State's office. And frankly, if you all want to get on an airplane, you're going to do it again in the next couple of years because you're going to need a real ID compliant license. So everybody's going to have to take in their documents. So what's occurred over the last, I'd say 5, 6, maybe 10 years, is this legal presence has to be shown in order to get a driver's license or a state ID, personal ID card. And that proof, it can be a visa, it can be a green card, all that's fine. But the system is now set up so those people don't get asked the question for registering to vote. That wasn't always the case. They used to just pretty pro forma ask everybody. And there have been a number of non-citizens who've been caught up in that. They're new, there's language barriers, people are shoving paper at them, they're signing stuff. They don't know what's going on until all of a sudden it comes out, they're trying to get their citizenship papers, and they come out and they go, well, you registered to vote, you know. And they can get around that, but if they actually voted, then they're pretty much out of luck. So do you want to call on people or?
Yeah. Are there other questions? Yes, back there.
Can teenagers get registered to vote when they get their driver's license in Michigan?
So the question is there a pre-registration? The answer is no, which is very unfortunate. So these are the kind of things that are impossible to get through our legislature. Terry Land, good, hard-working Republican from Grand Rapids, she was the first in the United States to make that recommendation. And a lot of clerks oppose it. They go, oh, my files are going to be full of all these people who really aren't qualified to vote. It's like, no, the system works on a birth date basis. So right now the law says you can register when you're 17 and a half. If you haven't turned 18 by the time of that election, that system's not going to put your name on the file. So it just makes sense. Let them register. They'll be registered at their parents' home. The real terrible thing that goes on now is that we're one of 8 states that have adopted a law the feds say you can do if you want, which if you're a first-time voter who registered by mail, you've got to vote in person. Kids going to college get tripped up on that every time. And you know who we have to listen to? It's not that young person, not even the parent, it's the mother. And when she calls about her kid not being able to vote, oh, you better believe, put ice on the phone. And actually, as I'm reading this Promote the Vote, I think this will override that, because this gives the right to any registered voter to vote absentee by mail. Anyone else?
Are there other questions? Yes.
Almost all my working years were in New Jersey, where just routinely walked into the voting booth, pulled the lever, there was a curtain. I mean, you know, total secrecy, total privacy, and I remember encouraging when I was a third grade teacher to go with your parents because you're allowed to go in. And the whole idea of, they came back saying, oh, it was so private, you know, they understood that. And then I moved to other states where you're talking about a selfie. I mean, when I walked in, I was aghast at the lack of privacy.
Right.
And the barriers weren't even high.
Right.
And you could easily look over if you, why would not everybody have a voting booth?
Yeah, they kind of went out. You know, what happened was they had those here when we were a paper ballot state. They were these tall curtain, they either had the lever machines that you're talking about, the big old things, or they had tall booths, good 6 feet, where you could go in and do a paper ballot. Then the punch card came, and they came with these little devices, or booths that are a long definition of booth, and they remained. And a lot of it becomes the ease of setting up and tearing down, and the room that's available. The interesting thing is that when you all voted on those lever machines, you didn't have any problem, did you? You didn't worry that there was no paper backup for that, because people trusted mechanics. They were like, okay, this is mechanical. And I mean, you threw that lever, there was no backup of what your vote was. When you did a recount with those machines, you open the back up and you reread the numbers, right? You go, well, that's what they are. Well, every once in a while you'd see a 0. You know, oh, well, that roller must be broken. It didn't turn. And then we'd have people call up and they said, we know you can figure out how I voted by turning those wheels backwards. And I said, nah, we're not that good. Okay, one more and then.
Is there another question?
I have one. If selfies are not allowed, which means that that the voters cannot have cell phones, then why are challengers allowed to have cell phones and have a place?
We allow.
They can cause, they do cause problems.
Well, they shouldn't either. So we allow people to have cell phones. We don't allow them to take pictures once they're in the room. If the line is in the room, they can't take a picture. There's nobody brave enough to go tell people today is that you can't bring your cell phone in and stand in line for 45 minutes. I mean, you're the second person in line waiting at Bigby's for coffee, and the first thing you do, you pull your phone out and say, I think I'll read half a newspaper, right? Yeah. So people can have their phones, they can come in, but they can't take pictures, and that's the same for challengers. And they have consequences if they do. And some, you know, there's always people that'll push the barriers, and that's part and parcel of the game. It's like the one clerk, she goes, I don't know what the heck's going on. This group came in, sat down, and they put hot dogs in every booth. And then when people left, they wanted to go in and put more hot dogs in there. And this clerk told, I said, well, just tell them to get out, you know. You can call the police, that's okay. So, you never know. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.